thank you guys so much for coming to this presentation. I know I'm running a little bit early, and thank you so much for the organizers of the Vegan Festival of Montreal for inviting me and for the amazing work that you guys are doing. So I'm going to talk to you today about the work of the Montreal SPCA's Investigations and Inspections Department. I'm the Director of Advocacy, and so it's one of the two departments that I oversee. So I think many people don't know that on top of our advocacy work, on top of the fact that we take in over 15,000 animals a year, we also have an inspections and investigations department that has over 7 inspectors who have law enforcement powers. And so what that means is we have inspectors that have the same powers as police, except for the fact that when they're doing inspections, they are not armed, and unlike the police, they work alone. And that really has to do with budgetary constraints. We do hope one day for their security that they'll be able to work in teams just like police officers. We receive over 10,000 complaints a year related to animal cruelty and neglect, and we inspect over 18,000 animals a year. We cover not only the island of Montreal, but we also cover Laval, a part of Montérégie, Lanaudière, and Laurentides. And so that's about 2 hours in every direction outside of Montreal, with a staff, as I said, again, of 7 full-time inspectors, 1 head inspector, an adjointe administrative, 2 dispatchers, 1 lawyer, Maître Sophie Gaillard, who should be somewhere here today, and myself. And because of the fact that we're so overwhelmed, again, 10,000 complaints, we're such a small staff, police are generally unwilling or unable or untrained to handle these complaints. We actually have a rotation system whereby everybody in the department volunteers their time to take on emergencies and complaints outside of working hours, including myself. Our inspectors, and I should mention, I think I'm pretty proud. We have a team, again, of 12 people. We're all women, except one man who spends his time surrounded by women working in this field. And our inspectors spend about half their time in the field responding to inspection complaints, following up on complaints, looking at premises where animals are kept, and that includes pet stores, breeding facilities, farms, kennels, and people's homes, as well as collecting evidence as part of their investigation. So if we decide that it's a case where we're going to recommend charges, whether it be under the criminal code or provincial legislation, they will deal with witnesses, take statements, interrogate the suspect, and of course ensure not only that the animal that we've removed from a situation is well cared for, but that we have an expert report to present to a prosecutor. And our inspectors come from a variety of different backgrounds. We all do this job because we are very passionate about the protection of animals and the meaningful protection of animals. So we're not just protecting dogs and cats, and we look at all of our cases not only as a way to protect individual animals, but as a way to change our legal system for animals. So some of the cases we're going to look at together in a couple of slides you'll see are what we call, I would say, test cases. The law is written in one way, but we're also looking at a way to expand the protection for animals under the law. And that means looking at cases involving farm animals, involving animals that you wouldn't normally think are going to be protected under the law, like reptiles or amphibians. And our goal, again, is to protect not only individual animals, but to really look at all of our cases in a way that we can broaden the legal system within the current framework that we have to ensure for more protection for all animals. As I mentioned, our cases involve not only dogs and cats, but also farm animals, exotic animals, and wildlife in captivity. And although we are constrained by the fact that some of our legislation does have some problems, we do believe that by pushing forward and creating good case law, we can not only protect individual animals, but provide further protection for all animals. Despite the fact that we get 10,000 complaints a year, our work is almost entirely funded by donations. So although we have powers that come from the federal government, they don't provide us with any funding in order to care for animals that we seized, in order to do our inspection work. And we receive a very, very small amount from the provincial government that covers a fraction of our overall costs. Luckily, again, we have donors that are very generous in helping us do our work. And just this year, we were able to purchase bulletproof vests for our inspectors, which sounds like maybe nothing, but when you're sending off your inspector 2 hours by themselves outside of the city of Montreal, not knowing what they're going to face alone in an area where they may not have cell phone reception, it is obvious of prime priority that we can ensure to the best of our ability for their security. So we applied 2 pieces of legislation, and again, I'm not here to make the case that either pieces of legislation are ideal for animals. In fact, I would say quite the opposite, but we do manage to do quite a bit with the tools that we have, while at the same time pushing for better legislation and better protection for animals. And so the criminal code, so the provisions under our federal legislation, are, at least in theory, can be applied by the police. So the SPVM and the SQ can apply these provisions. My experience over the last 10 years is that very often they're just not interested, they don't care, they don't understand how the provisions work, or they're really unable because they're constrained by budgetary restrictions. So their boss or their boss's boss says, listen, we're not going to spend money on bringing an animal to a veterinarian, getting an expert report, building a file. We have bigger things to do. And so the criminal code is enforced by inspectors like ours at the SPCA, who are given the power to act as special constables. The criminal code, at least in theory, protects all animals, so there's no specific species of animals that are exempt from the legislation. And the main provisions deal with cruelty and neglect. I only have 20 minutes, so I could give you a 2-hour presentation on what's wrong with the current cruelty provisions, but I will just explain 2 things that we have to deal with on a daily basis when we're looking at cases under the criminal code. One is that, unlike our provincial legislation, we not only have to prove that an act was committed, so in other words, someone neglected or did something, a commission against their animal, but we have to prove that they did it with criminal intent. And this is the language we see in the criminal code. It's the word willful. And the second issue that we face, and this is one predominantly for farm animals, is that what's prohibited under the criminal code is unnecessary suffering. And the way that our judicial system and judges in courts in Canada have interpreted the term unnecessary is essentially anything that is even the most trivial, that meets even the most trivial of human interests. For example, consuming animal products or exploiting animals for fur or entertainment, unfortunately has been interpreted as necessary within our legal system. However, that's not to say with the right judge and the right facts, we can't change that. And of course, keeping in mind that we want to eventually have the legislation change, we try to look at how we can get facts that will help us, hopefully, very much change the definition of unnecessary in the criminal code to provide further protection to animals that normally are, again, exploited and experience very little protection within the food system, etc. Under the criminal code, unlike under our provincial legislation, there is no mechanism for us to, I don't like the word dispose, but that's how our legal system uses the terminology, dispose of animals pre-trial. And what that means is that when we seize animals under the criminal code, the animals remain the legal property from the person from whom we've seized them, unless of their own volition they decide to surrender animals to us. And so, practically speaking, when we seize animals, that means that they remain the legal property of the person from whom they were seized for upwards of a year until the case goes to trial. And so if you're a foster family who's taken an animal that's been seized under the criminal code, that means that you're living with a year and a year and a half of not knowing if potentially the animal that you've grown to love and care for may be returned to the person who's accused of harming them. And that's obviously a huge emotional and financial burden for our organization. There are other provisions under the criminal code that I don't have time to deal with today, but they address bestiality. There's a special provision recently adopted dealing with killing law enforcement animals, animal fighting, and othering threats against animals. The maximum penalties under the criminal code, and of course, we never actually see penalties anything like this, is for cruelty, which is this language of unnecessary suffering, 5 years imprisonment and a $10,000 fine. And for neglect, a 2 years imprisonment, and a $5,000 fine. For us, what's most important under the criminal code is that if someone is convicted as part of their sentence, a judge has the opportunity to restrict ownership, custody, or contact with animals indefinitely for a certain period of time or with respect to certain species. And for us, that is the primary goal in sentencing. Of course, it's not our decision. We can make recommendations to the prosecutor, but what we want to see is that this person that's been convicted of cruelty and neglect is not able to come in contact or care for animals, specifically if we're talking about a context where animals are exploited for commercial purposes. The other piece of legislation that we apply is the Provincial Animal Welfare and Safety Act, otherwise known as B3.1. This legislation was adopted in December 2015, but its predecessor existed for a number of years. The legislation is enforced by the Ministry of Agriculture and certain inspectors at SPAs or SPCAs like ours, but we're only given the power to apply the legislation to dogs and cats. The legislation protects only domestic animals, so exotic animals and wildlife in captivity are actually excluded from our provincial animal welfare legislation. We're the only province that has that exclusion, with the exception of red foxes and American mink and on fur farms, and I'll tell you in a few slides why I think those animals have now been included under our provincial legislation. The legislation includes positive obligations, so owners or guardians having to provide minimum standards of care with respect to food, water, shelter, veterinary care, and also prohibits abuse and mistreatment. It's quite large, and actually the legislation, at least for dogs and cats, is relatively good. There are regulations for dogs and cats that also deal with very specific things such as housing, grooming, exercise, breeding, and facilities that need to obtain permits. Unlike the criminal code, we have the advantage that we only have to prove that the act occurred, so that criminal intent language that I talked to you about is not something that needs to be proven in a court of law. And one of the other advantages is that once we've seized animals and charges are laid, we have a provision in the provincial legislation where we can go before a judge and ask that the animals be liberated for adoption well before trial, which of course for the animals and for our organization is very much beneficial. The provincial legislation, and I don't have time to go into it, unfortunately does have exemptions for what are known as generally accepted practices within the scientific or agricultural industry. And basically what this means is that animal exploitation industries, specifically the food industry and the research industry, can determine themselves what activities or procedures they do that harm animals that will be exempt from the legislation. So of course that's a big frustration, but it's not, because we're not empowered to apply this legislation to farm animals, it's just something that we watch over very quickly with respect to the Minister of Agriculture. Under the provincial legislation, there's no possibility of imprisonment for a first-time offense. However, fines can go up to $62,000. And of course, there's also this prohibition period that's possible for sentencing, which is very important to us. So a judge can prohibit a person from having animals for their entire lives for a certain set period of time, or limit the number or species of animals that they can have under their care. So the way that our cases progress are a little bit different under the criminal code and the provincial legislation, and I don't have much time because I do want to talk about some particular cases, but we essentially will receive a complaint. An inspector will go out under the criminal code in certain circumstances just to inspect. We need a warrant. We will then determine based on the situation whether we're going to just educate the person. Sometimes it's just all that it takes. Whether we're going to provide the person with an official warning, or in certain circumstances, if we have enough, we will get a warrant and seize the animal or animals. For the provincial legislation, we cannot seize animals without the Ministry of Agriculture's approval. Once we've seized animals, we will then, of course, give them all the care that's required, get veterinary expertise, build our file, and then submit a file to a prosecutor, and then it's the prosecutor that decides whether or not they're going to lay charges against the individual or individuals involved. And if the person does not plead guilty, we then proceed to a trial. So I wanted to show you just a couple of examples quickly, and I'm going to go through them very fast, of some of the types of cases that we have. Some of them are more typical of what you would think SPCAs or SPAs do in terms of dogs and cats, and some I think illustrate more what I was trying to talk to you about using the current law as a means of expanding the protection for animals. So this is a case of essentially what we would call a typical puppy mill. We inspected once or twice, provided some warnings, and then eventually obtained a warrant to seize animals. And we obtained that warrant and were assisted by HSI Canada, who I think are up here somewhere, and proceeded to seize a total of 84 dogs. I was there myself that day, and I can tell you, of course, the situation was deplorable. Dogs in wire-bottom cages. It was filthy, very poor air quality. A number of the dogs had untreated medical conditions. The dogs outside were living on barren concrete. And one of the most horrific things, at least in the context of a breeding facility, is we found a number of deceased dogs in a freezer on the property. Once we collected all of the evidence, we seized all 84 dogs, so small and large dogs, and proceeded to bring them onto trucks, on their way to the SPCA to be given proper veterinary care, and again, to continue obtaining evidence for our case. So this is typical of what we do. We'll take all kinds of photographs while the veterinarians are examining the animals. The animals were subsequently, of course, given lots of TLC and care, brought to the SPCA for complete medical exams and grooming. And we had very recently a happy ending for all of the animals in this case. There were 18 infractions charged under the provincial legislation. All of the dogs were adopted into loving homes. So these are just two examples of the dogs in their current families. And the owner pled guilty to all 18 charges, was fined over $20,000, and has a lifetime prohibition on animal ownership, with the exception of 2 companion animals that she currently has that are sterilized and unable to be reproduced. So this next case falls into the category that I was talking to you about using what are unfortunately pretty abysmal laws, but nonetheless trying to expand the protection of those laws in our current legal system. And this is, in my knowledge, the first time a fur farmer has ever been charged with animal cruelty. And so this is the case of R versus Rodier, and it's still ongoing. And this case took place in 2014 when we received an anonymous tip about foxes on a fur farm in Quebec in horrific conditions. At the time, mink and foxes on fur farms were not protected under the provincial legislation, but in any case, we are not allowed to apply that legislation to animals other than dogs and cats, so we would have gone under the criminal code nonetheless. What we found was thousands of mink, over 100 foxes and 4 dogs. There were foxes and mink with untreated medical issues, and 2 of the foxes were actually dying when we arrived on the property, and we had to humanely euthanize them. There were foxes without any access to clean water. This is a pretty typical photo of what we saw, maybe not even the worst. And the animals were all in barren, filthy wire-bottom cages. For a number of reasons that I can't explain right now, we were forced to transfer part of the file to the Ministry of Fauna, but we nonetheless succeeded in removing many of the foxes from the property and having 6 charges laid, charges for cruelty and neglect, both with respect to dogs, foxes, and mink. And for us, this is, of course, because it's the first time a fur farmer has ever been charged with cruelty, we are concerned about not only the animals that were on the farm, but what the outcome will be with respect to this trial. The other thing that happened with this case was because of our issues with the Ministry of Fauna, and I can give you a 2-hour lecture about that, but I encourage you to look on our website and our public battle with them with respect to this specific fur farm. These animals were then included in December 2015 under the new animal protection legislation, and they're the only wildlife in captivity that have the protections under the provincial legislation. So the trial is coming up in about a month, and of course I encourage you to keep up with our case on our website. So this is another case that we treated under the criminal code. I'm going to go quickly because I think I'm almost done. We got a complaint about a pony with overgrown hooves. Our inspector went on site, and as you can see from the photos, Phoebus, this pony's name, Phoebus had hooves that were so overgrown that they were cutting into his legs and were obviously extremely painful. We provided the owner with a 24-hour warning to get emergency veterinary care for Phoebus, which the owner failed to do, and so we obtained a warrant and seized Phoebus. His owner pled guilty to animal cruelty and neglect, and he received an 18-month probation, a $7,000 fine, and a 10-year prohibition on animal ownership. And this is Phoebus in his new home. He's doing well, but has permanent damage to his legs due to the neglect that he suffered, but will be on medication and receiving physical therapy for the rest of his life. This is another example of a case, again, where we like to do what has not already been done, not only for the individual animal, but for, again, pushing the boundaries of the current legislation we have in place. And in my knowledge, this is the first case in Canada where criminal charges were laid involving an individual reptile or amphibian. These animals have very complex needs, and I think these needs are often overlooked, and because they don't necessarily seem as cute and as cuddly as some of the other animals involved in our cases, there tends to be a hesitation to recommend charges or to pursue a criminal investigation. We don't feel that way. We see all animals as equal, and of course wanted to do everything we could when we heard about this situation. And this was a case where we received a complaint about a turtle in a pet store with a huge ulcer on her back. And I don't know if you can see, if you don't know reptiles, the ulcer that you can see in this photo is so severe that it actually goes through to her ribs and to her lungs. So extremely, extremely painful for baby the turtle. Our inspector visited, and the pet store agreed to surrender baby to us. We brought her immediately to a veterinarian that has specific expertise in reptiles and amphibians. And unfortunately, due to the severity of the trauma and the neglect that baby had suffered, there was no other option but to humanely euthanize her. Nonetheless, we laid charges. The case went to trial, and her owner was convicted of cruelty and neglect. And again, for us, despite the sad ending for baby, nonetheless, at least a larger win, because we now have jurisprudence that it demonstrates that animal cruelty charges can be applied in cases of amphibians or reptiles in Canada. Finally, this is, I guess, a little bit more of a typical case, although it's a case we treated under the criminal code. This is a case of Dora. This was a complaint that we actually received outside of normal working hours, so not myself, but my other colleague was on call, and we received a complaint about a dog chained up in a snowstorm in the middle of January. It was January 2015. My colleague arrived on the property, and Dora was so weak that she couldn't even get up and was essentially starting to be buried in the snow. Due to this severity and urgency, and without getting into the explanation of our legal system, there are certain situations where we can seize animals under the criminal code without a warrant. It's when, for example, an animal is dying and we know obtaining a warrant would be such that the animal would be deceased before we return. And so Dora was urgently seized, brought back to the Montreal SPCA, where it was actually determined that with just appropriate veterinary care and a normal diet, she could regain weight. So this is Dora now, happy and healthy in her loving home. Her owner was charged with animal cruelty and neglect, and then was subsequently convicted on both charges. So I just wanted to give you, again, an overview of the types of cases that we look at, and a little bit more of an explanation of the work that we do in the Inspections and Investigations Department, and really emphasize that although we all feel, working within the system, that our current laws are not sufficient to protect animals, while we work to improve those laws, we can also use the laws that we do have to try and change the case law to push definitions of what is unnecessary, what animals receive protection, by focusing on cases where we receive complaints and cases where we know we're going to be able to test the system. And for us, that means expanding the protections provided to animals and ensuring for protection for, again, those 18,000 animals a year that we come in contact with. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an overview of our work, and I know the acoustics aren't great, so I thank you very much for your patience and for coming to hear me talk. I'm available afterwards if you guys have any questions.